Hey guys, I don't really have anything too substantive to say in this one, other than to say that I had an idea about I've been critical of Jordan Peterson's philosophy and his attitude on life and his ethical attitude about how humans should orient themselves in the world, um, and how there is some necessity of personal responsibility or something to that effect in human action and in human life. And that's sort of Jordan Peterson's, take on things is that, empowering the individual is important, but at the same time, that has to be balanced against a consciousness of responsibility and necessity and duty and all of these other factors. Um, I don't think that I think that I might take more of a Marxist or adopt more of a Marxist approach to the idea of responsibility. And that is only to say that responsibility and individual responsibility as a concept could be used as a ultimately as a means of exploitation. So you can see that there's a conflict of interest present here because a if the capitalist upper class, the um, business owners, employers, and other, I guess, uh, capitalists in a loose sense in the economy, um, they can use essentially the concept of personal responsibility to drive on um, their working class employees to ultimately force themselves to work harder so as to ultimately generate more value for the capitalist. So if you think about it, telling people that they're individually responsible, that they need to be socially productive, that they need to generate value, that they're responsible for their work and their productivity, and that there is a demand to contribute something of value, of productive value, and that we have a certain amount of responsibility to do that. In this sense, the concept of responsibility, people's willingness to accept the concept of responsibility can be exploited by capitalists so as to make their workers harder working because they internalize the idea of responsibility and the necessity and the social obligation to generate value, right? And so, in this way, the concept of responsibility can serve as a kind of persuasive tool or a kind of manipulation where where individuals are, I guess, indoctrinated in the idea of personal responsibility, driving them to be more productive, to generate more value, and put in more labor, right, to ultimately benefit the uh, the capitalist in a loose sense, right? That's the best way of putting it. Playing around with this theoretical arena we're operating in, and so in this sense, people's willingness to adopt the concept of personal responsibility can then be exploited by capitalists to then be able to drive their employees to work harder to generate more value for them and not so much more value for themselves. Um, in this sense, the concept of responsibility can be exploited to drive the working class, actors within these businesses, the working class, the workers, right, to ultimately drive themselves to work harder because they feel responsible. And so, in this sense, responsibility makes the rich man plump because he can exploit a person's willingness to accept the concept of individual responsibility to ultimately drive that employee to work harder on their behalf to generate more value for the capitalist that does not necessarily translate into more value for the laborer. So it's ultimately some sort of you know, um, weird imbalance of, how would I say this? Um, it defines a relationship. The concept of responsibility is a part of the relationship between, can be viewed as in a Marxist sense, as a part of the relationship between the capitalist and the laborer, where the capitalist uses the concept of individual responsibility and exploits their workers' willingness to believe in it, right? Um, to ultimately drive the workers to work harder to generate more value and profit for them that does not necessarily translate into more value for the laborer. So the whole concept of responsibility can be exploited to further the imbalance of value, right? Um, between to further the to ultimately further greater profit for the capitalist and drive on the dynamic of lesser profit, lesser value gained for the laborer. So, you know, that's just what I think about that. But it's an interesting way of looking at personal responsibility. Of course, the upper class and capital owners and capital accumulators and business owners and corporations love the idea of personal responsibility because ultimately it can be used to drive their employees to work harder on their behalf because then their employees feel responsible, right? And so that feeling of responsibility conceptually causes them to work harder, making them making it so that more value is generated for the capitalist, right? So in this sense, Marx would this is probably how Marx would view the whole concept of personal responsibility in context of the dynamic and the relationship between the capitalist and the laborer. Um, yeah, so I hope this is an interesting thought for people, and it's maybe another take on the value of the concept of individual responsibility and personal responsibility, and the sort of Jordan Peterson esque clean up your room, assume responsibility for yourself kind of stuff. I'm not saying any of that is invalid. Obviously, it's very good on some level. You know, I I totally agree with it on some level, and it doesn't come from a bad place inherently, but you can see how that concept can be exploited by capitalists to drive on the labor of the laborer to generate more profit for themselves at the expense of the laborer by causing them to internalize because as the society that the capitalist supports promotes a dialogue that causes the worker to internalize the idea of personal responsibility, driving them to work harder because they feel responsible, generating more value for the capitalist and ultimately not so much more value for the worker or the laborer. So, um, yeah, thank you for watching.